Yeah.
Right. And I can assure you that under that conglomeration of Egyptian travellers, there is in fact a Belgian-built two-axle tram. This evening's presentation is about the tramways of Egypt, past and present. There will be plenty of views of the scene today and in recent years, but also a few scenes from the past. And next, please, I particularly want to thank Roland Dessart, who is the author of an excellent book about the tramways in Egypt from 1894 to 1960 that were constructed and operated under the auspices of the very enterprising Belgian companies. So we'll see a few views of that as well. And first of all, I'm going to deal with Cairo. The Tramway du Caire, as they were called, obtained their first concession for operation of electric tramways in Cairo in December 1894. The specification was that electricity was to be used and the track gauge was to be meter. And before the service started, the concessionaire became part of the Société Générale de Chemin de Fer Économique in Brussels, famous chocolate and cream trams that we've seen at the Belgian Museum. And the whole concept was passed to the Tramway du Caire in March 1895. The system was inaugurated on the 12th of August 1896, and the first route was to Boulac, which is a very old part of Cairo, and in those days not a particularly pleasant area. It was the old docks area of Cairo before the docks were moved to Rod El Farag further north. But that was the first route, and it was also the location of the company's power plant. The original rolling stock was provided by UEG in Berlin, because at that time, in early 1896, the Belgian industry was not quite in a position to be able to produce and equip a complete new tramway system. The bodies of the cars, however, were built in Belgium by the Franco-Belge and Metallurgique companies. And things went well, and a second concession was agreed in 1897. In 1899 came a very important development. Next, please. When what became the showpiece line of the tramway was opened to the pyramids. This was a line of 12.4 kilometers, and at that time it was not possible to run a through service between central Cairo and the pyramid because of the fact that the bridges over the Nile were inadequate or not yet built, or were very suspect. And in fact, initially, for several years, the service to the pyramid started on the west bank of the Nile, and access to the city was by a steamboat connection. The pyramids line was originally laid as single track. It was doubled in stages up until 1921-22, and after 1908, the tracks were laid over the new Rodar Bridge, enabling a through service to be provided. The company prospered. The concession, the original 50-year concession, was later extended to terminate in December 1951, and later still to terminate on the 30th of June 1978. But as we probably realize, it never actually got that far. Next, please. Now, this is a view taken during the First World War, when just beyond the normal terminus of the Pyramids line was created a great military camp, particularly for troops from Australia and New Zealand. And the Pyramids line was subject to an extension to serve it. And here we are, as you see, the troops are crowding absolutely everywhere, on and on top of the trams to get them into Cairo. And this feature of passengers traveling everywhere in, on and around the tram was a feature of the Cairo trams throughout their existence. Next, please. Here's a view, an early coloured postcard view of the line to the pyramids as it was first built, single track alongside an avenue of trees, and totally undeveloped between the city and the pyramids. Next, please. And another view, again, similar sort of view. You will appreciate that views from these years are very difficult to obtain. Most of those that have been obtained are from commercial postcards. And another feature I should just mention here, as we get on, you will find that those of you who've been to Egypt, and I know some of you have, will be aware how difficult it is to take photographs of trams without obstruction by the free-range pedestrians who walk all over the track and in front of and behind and alongside the trams. So unlike my normal practice, where I make sure that nobody is obstructing the tram, whatever else we have in the background, in Egypt, I'm afraid you will have to put up with some which have human obstructions. Next, please. This series of 3 network plans, which is showing the development of the network from top to bottom in 1908, 1913 and 1917. We obviously haven't got time to go into it all tonight, but the network was quite compact, actually, in the central area of Cairo. And by 1914, the system was almost all double-tracked, having started in single-track, and the total kilometrage was 60.4 kilometers. In 1913, the first fully enclosed cars were ordered. Up until then, all the trams that had been delivered were of the open-sided type, and many of these survived for many years longer, including some right into the war years, the Second World War, and probably a year or two beyond. Next, please. There's quite a lot to get through tonight, so I can't give you more than a potted history of the system and the cars. But here again, we see a typical crush load on the motor car and the trailer, low floor trailer behind. And by the time we get to the interwar period, of course, the design of the trams has moved forward. Please, next, please. Here's a map of the Cairo tramway as it was in 1939. In this case, the map has been turned through 90 degrees from those that we saw a few minutes ago. But again, you'll get some idea of the way in which the route network has been developed in the interwar years, with great encouragement from the authorities in the capital, Cairo, and also after the British gave up its protectorate in 1922, there was a certain expansion of operation using an increasing number of local resources. Next, please. This is a series of 3 photographs showing the way in which rolling stock developed between the wars. At the top, we have what is a standard La Bourgeoise built motor car. You'll appreciate that all the rolling stock came from Belgium. It was a Belgian-controlled, Belgian-run company right until 1960. And the rolling stock inevitably was purchased from its home industry, although the evidence is that in terms of price, that was quite competitive with offers received from elsewhere. In the second photograph is taken at a crossing between the Cairo trams and those of Heliopolis. We'll come to Heliopolis later. And the rolling stock is number 248, which I believe to be one of what's called the Tientsin type. Now, Tientsin was one of many tramways abroad that was owned by the Empire Group based in Belgium, who ran the Cairo tramways. And although there was not much interchange of rolling stock, some of the cars that have been built during the war years and which could not be exported after the cessation of hostilities found their way to other tramways, and Cairo was one such recipient. And at the bottom, we see a typical La Bourgeoise car, nearest the camera, built in Belgium in 1927, a batch of 65 cars, and in this case with the centre entrance and doors at each end. These were very robust cars, many of which were still in service until the 1980s. And believe me, that's some achievement in Cairo conditions. Next, please. Now we're going to see some photographs taken in more recent times. And the colour views are from my collection, in this case, taken during my first visit at the end of 1974 and beginning of 1975, over the New Year period. Now, 112 here, you might imagine, was one of the earliest cars, and to some extent you would be right, because during the latter period of the war and in the post-war, post-Second World War period, there was a huge program of updating and improving earlier rolling stock. Some 200 cars out of a fleet of just over 300 were dealt with. And number 112 here is a good example. It would have been one that started off with open-sided bodywork, typical crossbench open car. And after 1913, as I say, all deliveries were of enclosed cars, and a large number of these older cars were rebuilt with bodywork mainly built in their own workshops in Cairo, but also by local body builders. And again, some of these were still in service in the late 1970s, early 1980s, by which time the trucks, the underframes, would have been well over 70 years old. Next, please. And some of the rebuilds formed 2-car trains of motor car and control trailer. An example you see here with the control trailer leading and the motor car taking power as the second car of the set. Again, another rebuild in that period in the 1940s and early 1950s. Next, please. This is a view at the Boulac terminus. This is the original 1896 terminus of the Cairo tramways in its latter days, which, as you can see, has certainly seen better times. The rolling stock is one of the 1927 La Bourgeoise cars, which were quite prevalent on the system. It's one that hasn't seen a great deal of care and attention, as you can see, but they weren't all like that. And here we are, the conductors getting ready to turn the trolley pole so that the car can reverse on the crossover, ready to go back. Next, please. A far more pristine conditioned car of the same batch, 1927 car, seen here in 1975 at El Eman Square. And as you can see, very smartly turned out in the Cairo livery of cream with red relief, black trucks and underframe. All the cars built up to this batch and the subsequent batch, which were very, very similar, 271 to 300, were two-axle and double-ended. Next, please. And this is how some of these La Bourgeoise cars ended up. This is on the line to Abbasier in 1975, early 75. And that, in fact, is a crowd of passengers who've got on 2 or 3 stops before the terminus to get on the car ready to come back. So intense was the crowding. And just a little anecdote here. I found myself with my travelling companion wedged in what became the driving compartment when the tram had reversed. And so intense was the crowding here that the poor old motorman could not move the controller handle beyond second notch because he was pressed right up against the controller and the window and everything by this crowd of people. And so the tram made very slow progress along the street. Next, please. But in 1932, the company took delivery of these 10 magnificent bogie cars, the first bogie cars for Cairo. They were known as Class 9. There were 10 of them. They had the first all-metal bodywork, and they were first programmed or designed in 1926, but delivered in 1932. Built by Les Ateliers Métallurgiques in Belgium and intended for the Pyramids line, which was the showpiece of the Cairo tramways, and everlastingly known as the Pyramid bogie cars. Interestingly, before they were shipped to Egypt, each car was tested on the visceral lines in Belgium, but we don't know exactly where. Some of these cars were still in service well into the 1970s. Next, please. I mentioned about the rebuilding of cars, and another set of cars, 40 of them, 40 motors and 40 trailers, type ML2, were rebuilt to a design resembling that of cars built in Belgium for the Electrail group, such as those on the Tramway de Charleroi, the TEPC in Charleroi, and also some in Liège, Escherang, and in the Ostend works. There is some dispute, not the only matter of dispute in the Cairo records, because they are not complete. And I have to say, once again, we owe an enormous debt of gratitude to Roland Dussart, who has done an enormous amount of research from official records held in Belgium, to which he had access, about the tramways of Cairo and Egypt generally. It has been said that these cars were actually built at the Electrail works in Belgium, but another view is that they were actually rebuilds. The motor car slightly longer than the trailer is nearer the camera here, built by local contractors in and around Cairo. We shall probably never know now, but I must say that that seems to be slightly more likely. The rather unrefined bodywork, I think, would not have been produced in Belgium. Next, please. But we're now in the post-war period when the tramways were falling out of favour. The first discussion about the possible use of trolleybuses took place as long ago as 1914, and they were periodically reconsidered in the 1930s, but nothing actually happened until 1948, when two French Vectra trolleybuses were imported to work an experimental line to Mbabe. This was one of the options that the city council was canvassing for future transportation needs. And the tramways to Cairo felt that they ought at least to show an interest in this possibility because the terms of their concession could no doubt be adapted to allow the operation of trolleybuses and indeed motor buses, which were also tried from 1952. In 1956, there was a concordat between the company and the city council to convert a number of tram routes to bus or trolleybus operation, but also to keep some of the more important tram lines. It got to the point when traffic congestion was seriously exercising the mind of the city council, and they were also demanding closures of certain routes, including the Showpiece Pyramids line. That, in fact, closed on the 1st of September 1957. As an experiment, the Port Side Road tram route was converted to trolleybus operation, but it was very unsuccessful. And then, on the 1st of December 1920, a political gesture, and a serious one, by the Egyptian government. Of course, as you know, the royal family had been overthrown in 1952, and we were now in the period of Colonel Nasser's regime. And in December 1960, the company's assets were sequestrated in retaliation for the treatment of locals in the former Belgian colony of the Belgian Congo, which we now know as Zaire. There were 18 years of the concessions still to run, but in fact, the company had to surrender everything overnight, and compensation was eventually paid. I say eventually, it didn't actually materialize until 1976, 16 years after the tramways were sequestrated. I mentioned that the Portside tram route had been converted to trolleybus, but this was unsuccessful, and the line was reopened, or relayed and reopened, in the 1970s. And the tramways then had something of a swan song, because a few routes having been closed, other new ones were opened, including some on completely new alignments and extending well outside the limits of the old tramway network. In the 1960s, the company became aware, or rather not the company then, but the municipal tramway as it was, became aware of the availability of some PCC cars from Los Angeles. And these ran, of course, on Los Angeles gauge, city gauge, which was 1067 millimeters or 3'6". And the trucks were therefore quite easily regauged to meter gauge for Cairo use. 134 of them found their way to Cairo. They were all cars built by the St. Louis car company. The pre-war and wartime batches were air electric cars, and those from 1948, of which this is one, were all electric. These cars were not all put into service. Quite a lot were broken up for spares, and a report from 1973 indicated that 48 of the 134 were still running at that time. They were finally withdrawn in the early 1980s. Next, please. The next batch of cars that arrived were these Tatra K5 articulated cars built by the Czech works in Prague, Tatra. And there were, I think I'm right in saying, about 200 of these. They were double-ended, which was essential for Cairo operation. And this one in the green livery was taken not too long after delivery, when it was still looking in pretty good condition. Next, please. But the engineers did not get on with these cars at all. And as you can see, the environment in which they had to operate was not of the best. Battered and bruised, they soldiered on, but not for anything like the length of time you would expect. For cars delivered in 1972, they'd nearly all been withdrawn by about 1981. And none survived, none has been kept. And after that, next please, the company turned to Japan, as we shall see in a minute. But a few of the very old Belgian cars did survive. Here are a couple of views taken in Abassier Depot in 1989. This is the former 334, which had been relegated to use as the Abassier Depot shunter. Next, please. Here's another of the 100 and something class of car, now fitted with a pantograph, you'll note, and dumped in the sidings at Abassier Depot. And in the background, another of those strange rebuilds resembling the Belgian electrail cars built in the late 1940s. Next, please. And also in the covered part of the shed, although it had been very badly gutted by then, were two of the Los Angeles PCC cars, which the staff insisted had been kept with a view to starting a tourist service in future years. But that's one of many things that never happened. Next, please. So for rolling stock, the municipal company turned to Japan and to Kinki Sharyo, who also provided rolling stock for the neighbouring Heliopolis undertaking and also for Alexandria, which we shall see later. They built 3 batches for Cairo. This is one of the second batch of 190, all of them single-ended but double-sided and Hungarian style, coupled back to back, so that they could get a twin set with only the 2 driving positions. These were put to work eventually on the majority of the local routes radiating from the centre of Cairo. This is a set of the second series built in 1979 and 80. Next, please. This is an example of some of the work that took place in those post-war years under the municipal operation. And this is one of several new routes, which, having been laid, the full extent of the plans was then cut back by several hundred meters, and to make sure that no driver tried to go the full way, as you see, some poles very forcibly laid across the track. And this is near the back of the railway station on the line to Ahmet Helmi. Next, please. And here the usual Cairo arrangement of stub terminal with crossover for reversing purposes. Next, please. And this is a view at Tyria Square. The tram service on the Heliopolis line had been re-extended here because the previous arrangement was unsatisfactory, and this new track layout was laid in, also used by the CTA trams, cream and red still. Next, please. Well, they couldn't quite get the back end coverage of the Belgian two-axle car that we saw at the beginning of the show, but riding on the bumpers was still quite a norm, and in fact illicit riding and fare dodging was a perennial problem in Cairo, and I suspect in all of Egypt. Next, please. Now, this is an example of the first batch of Kinky Chariot cars, of which there were 140 delivered from January 1978. It is said that the last 30 were built locally, and that may very well be true. They looked a bit heavy for urban service and the crowded streets of the centre of Cairo, which is why for the second and third batches, the design was changed to that you've just seen on the red and cream cars, and also, as you'll see, in the third batch. Next, please. This 6000 class of car was also to be found on a neighbouring tramway that we'll see shortly. And again, single-ended, double-sided, coupled together as a two-car train. Next, please. And you can see there, although the rolling stock was route confined, there was, as far as I'm aware, no mixed operation of car types on any of the routes. There was some, obviously some commonality of running, and you see here in the distance there, the blue and white livery of the third batch of Kinky Chariot trams. Next, please. And they were built in 1981 to 2. In this time, the municipality was in the throes of extending the metro system, which caused great disruption to the tramways, and the previous pattern of services, which had involved through routing across the main junction at Ramses Square by Cairo Central Station, was cut, with new stub termini temporarily laid down with crossovers in adjacent side streets. And this is the location for one of these views, seen in February 1989. Next, please. And another one, this quite well shows up the single-ended design of the rolling stock, and on the turning loop, somewhere in the centre of the city. I honestly can't remember now exactly where. Next, please. And another of these two-car sets, the last series, negotiating street track in the centre of Cairo. Next, please. This is the terminus at Abbassieh, two-track terminus. Abbassieh was always the most important route on the Cairo tramways from a point of view of passenger loading, always had the most intense service. Even in the very earliest days, it was a 3-minute service. And towards the end, in the 1980s, it's still about a 5 or 6 minute service of coupled cars. Next, please. The city tramways in Cairo were eventually closed during the 1990s. Detailed information as to when is not easy to obtain. All I can tell you that it was during the 1990s, but some of the trams found another lease of life when they were grafted onto the Heliopolis lines. More about Heliopolis in a moment, but here's one of those third series Kinky Chariot cars, repainted into CTA red and cream livery, actually operating on the Heliopolis system. Next, please. And another one at El Mataraya, where the lines of the formerly separate Heliopolis undertaking and Cairo came together at right angles. A through service was later introduced once the two operations were much more effectively merged. Next, please. And here's one of the first series, I think one of the few of the first series that survived to be repainted in Cairo livery. A good example there on the left of the atrocious track. I haven't said a lot about track, but although where laid on reservations on new routes, it was pretty good, some of the older track was absolutely execrable. And the ride quality was appalling, and needless to say, speeds were incredibly slow. Next, please. And one set, maybe more, one set was repainted in this yellow and blue livery and operated on the Heliopolis lines. This is seen at El Mataraya. Next, please. So my own memory, my favourite memory of Cairo has to be this wonderful old Belgian car going up Clock Bay Street, which had been operated by trams right from the earliest times. And I think there are almost as many people hitching a free ride as are paying their fares. That's certainly another way of running a tramway. Next, please. So we'll move now to Heliopolis. Now, Heliopolis is a completely new town that was developed on land reclaimed from the desert beyond Abbasiyeh in the northeast of Cairo. It was an area of 25 square kilometers, and it was developed under the enterprise of the Empire Group, the Belgian company that ran the tramways in Cairo, and it became really a company town with total development in the hands of the Belgians. They provided water, gas, electricity, and transport, as well as arranging for the building of a huge new town, which was seen, quite rightly in those days, to be a garden city to the crowded metropolis of Cairo city. Agreement was eventually reached with the, as it jolly well ought to be, as they were in the same group, with the Cairo Tramways Company for the through operation between Cairo and Heliopolis. And Baron Empire, who'd been raised to the baronetcy in 1907 by order of the king, was determined that there should be a high-speed electric railway between the two towns, two cities, although what they termed the metro turned out to be a heavy tramway rather than a light railway. There were intense arguments between the two companies over the initial routing to be adopted to serve Heliopolis. The company wanted to go in via Abbasiyeh, which of course was an area served by the Cairo tramways, and arguments raged over fares and conditions and so forth. But eventually a deal was reached, and the first service between Cairo, the Corniche, that's on the banks of the Nile, and the centre of Heliopolis started on the 9th of May 1908. Next, please. Here's a map of Heliopolis as it developed later. Quite difficult to understand. I just want you to get some idea of the complexity of the network. And although it won't show up very well there, there were quite a number of sections of route which, having been laid down, were later taken up when it was decided that the area was ripe for further development. Heliopolis itself could actually almost do with a book on its own. Next, please. This is two examples of the first rolling stock of the Heliopolis lines. These two-axle cars were, in fact, the only two-axle cars operated in Heliopolis, and they were the ones that opened the first route via Rabassier in 1908. Next, please. Oh. Well, here's another example of one of the Heliopolis two-axle sets, motor and trailer, that were used on the first route and then subsequently on local routes in Heliopolis. Next, please. But the real gems were these bogie cars, of which there were 26, and they were ordered for the Metro, the express non-stop ride between Cairo and Heliopolis. It opened on the 11th of July 1910 with these cars, and here's one of them 65 years later, believe it or not, still running on the Suez Road route in Heliopolis. These cars were much feted in the technical press. They were built by the Atelier de Construction du Nord de France and by Franco-Belge. And although not the case latterly, they were originally dual equipped. Trolley pole for use on the street track in Cairo and pantograph on the interurban sections. And they were also dual voltage, 525 volts in Cairo, 750 volts in Heliopolis. And they're quite magnificent cars. 65 years later, they were showing their age, as you would expect. And as a celebrated comment by one of my traveling companions on that occasion, when we were on one of these cars and it was rocking and rolling its way back to the center of Heliopolis, he said, you know, this car is articulated in all three planes. And it was quite amazing. Lovely vehicles. Very sad that one hasn't been kept. Next, please. Here's another view of one of these with a view that perhaps shows the environment better than before. This is on the Suez Road route. And all right, we've still got the hangers on and hangers off, but as you can see, the development is a lot more spaced out and more attractive townscape than was to be found in the city. And needless to say, the well-to-do located to Heliopolis. Next, please. The next batch of cars that was built for Heliopolis, in fact, were not ordered until 1948 and delivered in the following year. And this is a view of them under construction in the workshops of the Atelier de la Dille in Belgium. It has sometimes been said that these cars were built locally, but as far as we can tell, they weren't. They were built actually in Belgium. And this series of 36 cars was tested on the Belgian vicinal line between Brussels and Louvain. Next, please. Here's one of the Belgian-built cars, La Dille, again approaching the centre of Heliopolis, and a very distinctive electrail design of bodywork on this car. That couldn't be anywhere else but Belgium. Next, please. But they were also the last new motor cars built for Heliopolis. After then, the company turned to Japan for its rolling stock, who provided relatively cheap cars, which proved to be quite reliable. The first of them were 20 of these bogie cars, which operated singly, and they were also to be found on local routes in Heliopolis, although I think originally they had been used on the metro because they were designed to be coupled together. Next, please. Here's another example showing that they're well adapted for Egyptian conditions. And the next, please, because following those, and this is at the El Nasser terminus, one of several routes that was opened in Heliopolis during the 60s and 70s with new rolling stock ordered from Japan. The Nusa route in 1955, El Nasser in 62, Aziz Fahmy in 1968, Darassa, actually a reopening of a part of an old route in 1968, Merghani in 1969, and El Mataria in 1972. This, as I say, is at El Nasser. Next, please. And from then on, Japanese rolling stock became the standard almost each year, and as each batch was ordered, so it increased in overall length. The first batch was for two-car trains of the traditional back-to-back, in other words, single-ended, double-sided configuration. And by then, the entire network in Heliopolis was worked by tramcars that were pantograph equipped. Next, please. This is a view at Darassa, which was a reopened line to part of the old Cairo area, which had been worked as part of the Abbasiye line, abandoned in 1934. Next, please. Now, everybody will tell you that the Heliopolis tramway is and was entirely reserved track, which is not quite correct. There was a short stretch of a few hundred meters in Ismailova Street in Heliopolis, which was most definitely laid in the street. And as you can see, whilst there is a small pedestrian platform on the far side of this car, on this side, nearer us, the road and the track are completely at one. And here we are, one of the second batch of Japanese cars, which by then had acquired a third piece of rolling stock in the middle. They varied over the years. Some were trailers and some were control trailers. Next, please. And finally, they ended up with a series of 4 cars coupled together to cope with the loading that by the 1970s and 80s was experienced on the tramway. And in this case, they had 1 trailer and 1 control trailer as the center cars. Next, please. Originally, the metro extended right down to the Corniche, the riverbank in Cairo, and later on, the route was cut back to Cairo Central Station because of severe congestion. But the inadequacy of the town tramways service on this section prompted the route to be reopened. And in the 1970s, the section down to the Corniche was reopened and lasted at least until 1989 and probably a year or 2 longer. Next, please. And in this view, you'll see the actual common operation between the Cairo City Tram there on the left and the Heliopolis car on the right, and going down towards the Corniche under this enormous traffic viaduct. Next, please. Later on, liveries changed from that light green and cream. Here's one in the darker green and cream. A two-car train, as loadings tended to decrease in the last years of the Heliopolis trams, then the rolling stock put out tended to be of shorter dimensions too. Next, please. And another new livery with this quite striking blue and green, in this case with a three-car train. This taken in, I think, 2003, 2003, on the reserve track in the centre of Heliopolis, just after it's come off the street track. Next, please. And just to remind us of the street track, which survived until the end, a three-car train going along it on its way to Cairo. Next, please. Later on, after the Corniche extension was cut back yet again to Cairo Central Station at Ramses Square, this is the terminus in central Cairo, with the fairly generous boarding arrangements there by Cairo's standards, and the three-car train has just arrived ready to reverse. And in the distance, you can see the next one hanging back, waiting to come in to the terminal stub. Next, please. In Heliopolis is the last resting place of Baron Ampin, the great Belgian tramway entrepreneur whose tentacles extended over 5 continents. And he certainly ran tramways and saved more than any other one person. He was very proud of Heliopolis and moved and relocated there. And he decreed that when he died, he was to be buried in a mausoleum. And there is the mausoleum, recently restored with government funds, very fine building in the centre of Heliopolis. If you're very fortunate, you can be taken to see Baron Ampin's tomb, great tramway man. You don't get that very often. And down below, you'll see photographs of a former Cairo tram being brought in to be located on a stretch of rail, a plinth really, in the gardens of the mausoleum to act as a memorial to this great tramway man. And this was delivered in 2019, so quite recently. Next, please. And here you'll see a closer up view, or a distant shot, first of all, of this two-axle tram. It's not a Heliopolis car, it's a Cairo tram, but nevertheless, it's perfectly legitimate because Baron Ampin was a director of that company for many, many years. And so it's nice to see something here to commemorate him. Next, please. And here you'll see another view of this car. Four-wheeler, of course, double-ended, La Bourgeoise type. And more recently, next please, another tram has been found and restored and placed on a totally separate piece of rail on the opposite side of the main road from the mausoleum in separate grounds. It's rather nice. Next, please. Now, before we move on, I just have to mention 6th of October City, which is a development of an arts complex for the film industry and theatre and so forth. to the west of Cairo, and there they have laid down a short length of tram line, probably about 600 or 700 meters in length, and they have there a car, La Brugeoise car of the 1927 batch, looking a bit sad, but nevertheless it has survived and it is in working order, or it was the last time I asked. So it's worth knowing about that. There's another relic of Cairo trams as they were. Next, please. And we're just going to have a few shots now of a subsidiary tramway of Cairo, which is in the steelworks town of Helwan, which is about 25 kilometers south of Cairo and reached by an urban railway. The tramway here was run by the Cairo Transport Authority using cars of their first series, and again, of course, built to meter gauge, and to provide links between the railway, with which it did not connect very conveniently, and the industrial and areas and the zones of habitation. Next, please. It was a very down at heel place, and this was what passed for the central tram terminus, which was in fact several hundred meters distant by walk from the railway station in Helwan. So not a good interchange at all. Next, please. The line opened on the 19th of February 1981, and there was one main line with a branch. And here's another view at that railway station terminus, so-called. Two cars there. Next, please. And this is a view at the junction between the main line and the branch. Next, please. Later on, the cars were repainted into Cairo red and cream. And this again is at the railway station terminus with the open pit for inspections. Don't want to fall down that on a dark night. Next, please. And later on, some extensions were built, which I must say I found quite remarkable. But on the occasions I went there, passenger traffic was almost nil. I guess that it was busy at shift change times, but I never saw any good loading. This is a view taken at the depot entrance, where a car has just arrived from service and somebody's getting down there to examine some probable defect. Next, please. And later still, an extension was built off the line to the railway station that went, well, I can only call it somewhere of nothing. I never did discover the official name because when I went there, the tram could not get to the terminus. Next, please. The reason being that the entire line had been engulfed by an overflow of sewage. And believe me, Egyptian sewage is not to be tampered with. And this is as far as the tram could get. And you can see in the background this great overflow. There's no development in the immediate vicinity to serve. And had the route been fully opened, the tram would have gone round to the right, past that blue and white van for a few hundred meters to a stub terminus. Next, please. The Helwan tramway did have one or two nicer parts. Here's one at a junction on one of the extensions that was built in the 1990s. These views were taken in 2004. Next, please. However, not so salubrious here, with an industrial complex just out of sight to the left, some fairly emaciated animals sort of grazing at the side of the track, and the car lurching its way upon fairly dishevelled track. The Helwan tramway has since closed. I forgot to look up the date, but it was somewhere around 2015 or 2016. So don't bother getting on a train from the centre of Cairo to Helwan. There is nothing to be seen here. Next, please. And we're going to have 5 minutes break in a minute, but before we do, I want to show you a tramway which you'll hardly ever see in any presentation on Egypt. This is Port Said. Port Said was a town built for the construction workers of the Suez Canal. The first buildings were in 1859, the canal opened in 1869, and after that, of course, the town remained, it developed, and after a while, it was felt that there was a case for a tram service along the principal streets of the town, and a concession was awarded to an individual in 1899 to build a horse tramway to 600mm gauge. Very narrow, even for a horse tramway. It's just under 2 feet gauge. And even before operation started in 1899, the concession changed hands, and it fell into the lot of the Chemin de Fer de Basse Egypte, which was a railway company running in the lower areas of Egypt. From the outset, goods traffic was important to this little tramway. It served a docks area as well as a residential area. And in 1909, plans were put forward to electrify the tramway and convert it to meter gauge. But the outbreak of war stopped any progress. And although in 1926, the operator is recorded as still looking at the possibility of electrification and conversion, the local authority by then had decided that it wanted buses, not outdated tram cars, and they wanted to lift the rails in the Rue de Lesseps, which is probably where this view is taken. They could not agree on any purchase price, and in fact, despite advertising the tramway for sale, there were no takers. And the company said that, well, in that case, the best thing they could do would just be to shut up shop. And that's exactly what they did. The tramway ran for the last time on the 31st of July, 1931. The company renounced the concession and went off into the sunset. Gentlemen, shall we have 5 minutes quick break before we deal with Alexandria? Just 5 minutes in case any personal needs.
Thank you.
Are you there, Robert?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Good. Well, after the break, we'll deal with Alexandria.
Yep. Just say when you are ready.
Yes. Give it 2 or 3 minutes. Gentlemen, so we'll deal now with Alexandria. Alexandria, I'm pleased to say, is the tramway that is still running, which makes a pleasant change. And it's quite a complicated story, but I will try to simplify it. It's often said that there are two tram systems in Alexandria, the town or city system and the interurban line to Ramleh. And one can well understand that they may be considered as separate, although they are all now under the control of the Alexandria Passenger Transport Authority. However, they certainly started off separately. Next, please. First of all, I'm going to deal with the so-called interurban line, the Alexandria and Ramleh line. Next, please. First of all, you need to know that in contrast to dusty, dirty Cairo, Alexandria is a most pleasant place on the Mediterranean. The air is much fresher. It actually does get a few days of rain each year. And it is a thoroughly different character to Cairo. Pleasant place to spend a few days. Next, please. Now, the Alexandria and Ramleh tramway is in fact one of the oldest tram lines in the world, and its central section between Bulkley and Sidi Gaba Mosque, which was the original line, is still running today over 160 years later. A concession was granted to a British entrepreneur in August 1860 to construct a railway between Alexandria and the developing area of Ramleh, or Victoria as it was known in those days, and service began on the 8th of January 1863. It was provided by an English company, the Alexandria to Ramleh Railway Company. And the first section was between Bulkley and Sidi Gaba Mosque, which is actually the heart of the present line. It's about 2/3 or 3/4 of the present line. But of course, today it's much more heavily developed than in the original days. And the original line was in fact horse-drawn and later converted to steam traction, as you see here. Next, please. It was decided in 1902 that the time had come to convert to electricity, and permission having been obtained, electric operation started on the 31st of December 1903. British rolling stock was supplied, 32 motor and 20 trailer cars from the BEC on 1903 on Maguire trucks. Dick Kerr Company provided various items of electrical equipment. These cars were formed into 2- and 3-car trains and immediately brought a great increase in traffic and revenue. And in 1908 arrived a batch of cars from the United Electric Car Company, UEC, in Preston, including the first double-deck cars, which were a feature of the Alexandria and Ramleh line for almost its whole existence, and indeed still are. This is one of the last tramways anywhere in the world still running double-deck cars, albeit they are a very small minority of the present fleet. And the tramway then embarked on what I can only describe as a solid but unadventurous future, with the line having been extended to Ramleh, Victoria, and also to a new central terminus in Alexandria at Place Lagoule. In December 1928, the city bought out the company, and it was municipalized. That brought to an end an enormous period of feuding between the company and the municipal tramways that had been built to serve the city, but I'll come on to those in a minute. After the municipalization, the Ramley Company also worked some of the local lines on behalf of the city tramways. And then in 1946, the municipal tramways' original intention, which was to grab hold of the British company, achieved its objective when the two undertakings were fused together under what is now the APTA, the Alexandria Passenger Transport Authority. One of the things that happened after that fusion was that the Ramley line acquired 10 sets of HR2 class bogies from London Transport, who of course were busy abandoning their tramway, but their equipment was deemed extremely suitable for the standard gauge lines of the Alexandria and Ramley. And they also acquired 80 sets of E3 type electrical equipment from the same source. Next, please. One or two views of the early rolling stock on the Alexandria and Ramley, and this apparently was quite a common formation, a single deck motor car hauling a double deck trailer, uncanopied and indeed open-sided upstairs. Very interesting combination. Next, please. And here's another view, but in this particular case, both the cars are motor cars. That's at Buckhouse Station. It doesn't look like that today, but it's still served by the same line. Next, please. In the 1920s, three-car trains, all single deck, were formed up, but also some double deck rolling stock was either built or rebuilt. The actual history of the rolling stock on the Alexandria and Ramley is to some extent enshrouded in mystery. We know that some double deck cars became single deck, and believe it or not, the converse applied. And some of them were later rebuilt by Oerlikon. Next, please. Now, we'll go now to the city lines. And the city lines have a history which is entirely dominated by jealousy, mistrust, fraud, embezzlement, you name it. All the features that go to work against a tramway were there present. One of the problems was that its aim at the outset was to acquire forcibly, if necessary, the Alexandria and Ramley line, so that the whole thing could be run under municipal auspices. In the meantime, the city tramways got their first concession in February 1896, and the first route was inaugurated on the 11th of September 1897. It lasted just under a month, when the whole thing had got already into such a state that the French company, which had promoted the concession and was running the tramway, was taken over by the Belgians following an appeal to them for more funds. The French had got insufficient money to develop the tramway. These first cars were called Walker cars. All that's known about it is that Walker provided probably the electrics and maybe the trucks. They were a supplier of trucks and electrics in the very early days of electric traction, and Dickinson provided the trolleys, but more than that is not known. Needless to say, if anybody watching tonight has more concrete information about any of the rolling stock we're talking about, we'd be delighted to hear about it. In 1898, the fleet consisted of 40 motor and 40 trailer cars, including 2 series of these walker cars. And the cars in those days were what was described as convertible type. In other words, summer and winter, they could be adapted according to the seasons. They had 3 classes, first, second, and harem. The harem compartment being reserved for the ladies. But they were the cars, that is, were of a very primitive design and quickly superseded by more modern equipment, and cars of this type were retired from service by 1909. In the meantime, new rolling stock of more modern design had been acquired from the Belgian manufacturers Franco-Belge and Beaumont-Mapon. The company negotiated for extensions to the system, which were granted, and a long line to Mex opened in May 1898. Its source of traffic was apparently a major casino at Mex, which is on the coast, and the remainder of the concessions were opened in 1899 and 1900. By then, the tramway company, the city company, had got very grandiose ideas and was aiming to buy the Alexandria and Ramley, but its proposals were not endorsed by all its shareholders or its governing council, and it wasn't long before the tramways of Alexandria were in total chaos. An order was placed for rolling stock on the assumption that they would be taking over the Alexandria and Ramley. But when it became obvious that this was not going to happen, the rolling stock was just straightforward cancelled. The biggest cancellation of a rolling stock order for the USA supplier they'd ever had. Further extensions around the bay to Ras El Tin and inland to Noosa opened between 1906 and 1911. And in 1927, the company, through its municipal shareholders, decided to buy the Alexandria and Ramley. And as I say, that company was taken into municipal ownership at the end of December 1928. The whole thing was municipalized from 31st of March 1946 and wound up, that's the company, the city company, as all the assets were now in Egyptian hands, which of course was really the object of the exercise in the first place. There was certainly by 1946 a desire to ensure that foreigners had minimal investment in assets in Egypt. The rolling stock situation, again, is not entirely clear, but what we can say is that between 1966 and 1968, Toronto exported 139 PCC cars to Alexandria, most of them being used on the Ramley line in 3-car trains. Some were certainly used on the urban system, and some were never used at all, but broken up for spares. When I first went to Alexandria in January 1975, there was still a handful running on the Alexandria and Ramley, but they were very much a minority by then. In 1972, Copenhagen Duvags came to Alexandria. The purchase was for the entire fleet of 100 of them, but one of them, 841, was destroyed in a welding accident before leaving Copenhagen, and in exchange, Copenhagen sent 2 rail grinders. Most, but not all, of those Duvags are still in service. And for cars built in the mid-1960s, which are now coming up to 60 years of age and working in pretty dreadful conditions in Alexandria, that is a remarkable tribute to them. They still maintain the greater part of the urban service. In 1982, 15 two-car sets of Kinky Chariot cars, the usual configuration, single-ended but double-sided, were purchased. And in 1985 and 6, another 15, this time built by a consortium of the Hungarian Ganz firm using Duvag bogies, were supplied. So a total of 60 cars in all, 2 batches of 30. And more recently, in 2018 and 2019, 15 Ukrainian-built type K1 articulated cars have been built. They're designated the K1E6, in other words, 6-axle cars. And this has to some extent helped to modernize the fleet, although the increase in traffic has been such that additional services have had to be provided on parts of the Ramley line. So next, please. And here's an early view taken probably just before the First World War. It says Ramley Station Street, one of the cars on the local service, city service. Next, please. Here's a plan of the tramways of Alexandria. If you were able to study it in depth for a while, you could work out when the various sections of route were opened. But as you could see, it's one of those tramways that's constrained by geography. The Mediterranean laps right at its shores, and it does have some quite attractive sections of route, as well as the usual rather nondescript European industrial, Egyptian industrial areas. Next, please. Now we're on the Alexandria and Ramley, and here is a coupled set of cars dating from the 1920s, but rebuilt since. And some cars of this type were rebuilt using the HR2 bogies from London. Next, please. And also at Arabi Square, as in the last set, is this 3-car train of former Toronto PCC cars. They are of the pre-war design, so they're quite elderly, 1937 to 9, but still giving yeoman service on the Ramley line. Some of them were latterly formed up into 2-car trains. Next, please. Now, this was a typical formation on the Alexandria and Ramley in the 1970s. 2 single-deck bogie cars, which we believe to be built in the 1920s, although some sources have suggested that some of them may be rebuilt from earlier rolling stock. I don't know about that. And a double-deck controlled trailer. And in those days, the double decks were all at the Ramley end of the sets. Next, please. And here's a 2-car train, similarly, heading out towards what is then El Nasser or Victoria, with the double deck, which, as I say, is a controlled trailer heading out to Victoria. Next, please. And one of the several instances of quite impressive earthworks, a section here where the tramway is given a relatively flat level track with reserve track in the middle of a fairly wide dual carriageway. Next, please. Alexandria has always had a good selection of works cars, some of great antiquity, and it's a pity we don't know more about them. This is at Bulkley in 1975 with this little 2-axle motor car pushing this flat truck trailer. Next, please. And here we see a fairly venerable tower wagon parked up on the siding at Bulkley. And this appeared to be the regular parking point and still is for works cars. It's a wonder they don't get damaged, but it appears that they don't. And this is certainly a fairly venerable specimen. Next, please. This is one of the cars that was rebuilt with a protruding cab seen at the Victoria or El Nasser terminus in 1975. Next, please. And one of the standard double decks, which is interesting because of the exposed ribbing on the lower deck, which may well indicate that it is a single deck converted to double. Certainly I have read, but I have no other supporting evidence that there were examples of that practice, and it's probable, if it's true, that this is one. Next, please. Now we go then to the town tramways or the city tramways, and by 1975, the great majority of services were run by these ex-Copenhagen Duvags, which, although they'd had their KS insignia removed from the front desk, still sported quite a good representation of the Copenhagen livery. Next, please. Here's another one. This is on the Ras-el-Tin route. Much of the Alexandria tramway is laid as street track. There's not a great deal of reservation, so they have to fight their way between all manner of other road vehicles, some animal drawn. Next, please. Alexandria has always had a wonderful fleet of works cars. This is at Carmouse, which is the location of their original depot of 1899 and the power plant. Again, I wish I knew more about the car. It looks as though it could be something that originated from a Belgian factory. Whether any of our Belgian friends can confirm that, I don't know. I'd be very interested to know. Next, please. And here's number 55. Similarly, I think of the same batch. Even the redoubtable Mr. Price, John Price, a great expert on all things tramway, was unable to shed any light on the provenance of these cars. Next, please. But what he did go into extreme fits over was this particular car, number 402, which was specially brought out of Carmouse depot for us to photograph. And he had to have a blown up version of this car because he was convinced from looking at the original photograph that it was on a BEC truck. And having had the photograph enlarged, he looked at it carefully and exclaimed, yes, it's definitely a BEC truck. It must be the last in the world. Next, please. I mentioned that Copenhagen sent 2 rail grinders in exchange for the Duvag car that was burnt out in an accident in Copenhagen. Here's one of them, 409, passing Pompey's Pillar on the way to Carmouse. Pompey's Pillar is one of many ancient sites of great antiquity that are visited by tourists in and around Alexandria. Next, please. This is the dump at Mex. And when I visited in 1975, you see many of the Toronto PCCs have ended their days here, including some that clearly never entered service. The one on the left there and the one in front of it are still in Toronto Transit Commission livery, obviously being cannibalized for spares. Next, please. Now, we're going now to some views taken in 1989, and this is one of those single-deck cars dating from the mid-20s that survived the Great Cull and became a works car. Quite might needed 2 pantographs, I'm not certain, but I suppose better safe than sorry. Next, please. And this was the lineup of works cars at Bulkley in 1989. Certainly a couple of quite fine and very fussy built tower wagons. Next, please. Now, by now, all the old rolling stock had been withdrawn, although 1 or 2 pieces had survived in the depot. And this is a view at El Nasser or Victoria in latter days, with 2 3-car trains of these Kinki Chariot cars built in Japan that were acquired by the ATTS for the interurban line. And there were, I think I'm right in saying, 108 of them, I think. Next, please. The Copenhagen Duvags, however, was subject to considerable rebuilding in their works. The inability to acquire appropriate glass is always a problem with tramways like this that run in difficult times and difficult areas. And as you can see, this one has been fitted with smaller windows and panels beneath. This is at Alexandria Station. Next, please. Now, here's an example of the first batch of Kinki Chariot 2-car sets heading out to Ras El Tin. Quite a nice area, this, a good area. And you'll see more of it in a minute. Next, please. That's in their original condition and original livery. And here's a view in a later livery with the cream and yellow and blue relief. Now, it was about this time that difficulties were being experienced with loading on the Ramley line. And for the first, no, that's not quite right. I was going to say for the first time ever, that's not true, because until the late 1970s, some journeys on the Ramley line had run through over city tracks for about a kilometre or so, past Sarabi Square to a stub terminus at Manshia. But that was given up. And after that, in order to provide additional capacity, some of these cars were adapted for joint operation over the 2 networks. Next, please. This is one of the Gantz sets, you see here, the second batch of 2-car trains that were delivered in 1985 and 6. Next, please. And a closer up view of one of these Gantz sets going back from Ras El Tin. Next, please. Another works car, this one on the town system. Again, nobody seems to have any information about its origin. Such a pity. It was parked up here for years and years, but when I was there 18 months ago, it had gone. Next, please. There's another works car in the sidings alongside Carmousse Depot. Next, please. Now, they had always said after the double decks were withdrawn in the late 70s, early 80s, that they were going to have some more. But as is the way with things, you imagine that these people are making it up to get rid of you. But lo and behold, in 1997, 6 of these double-deck bogie cars were delivered by Kinki Chariot. And again, formed into three-car trains with two motor cars. Well, that's not correct. There are two single-deck cars attached, and in this case, all the double decks are at the Alexandria end. We originally thought that they were controlled trailers, but they're not. They're actually full motor cars. So why haven't they got a pantograph on the roof? Very simply, there isn't room for it, with the headroom between the top of the upper deck and the overhead wiring. So the pantograph is mounted on the middle car. You can see there, the middle car has got a pantograph, and it's connected by jumper cables to the double decker, but the double deck is the motor car. Next, please. And here's another view taken more recently of one of these three-car trains, of which there are six. There are 6 double-deck cars in the fleet. As I say, they're all now at the Alexandria end. Next, please. Here's a view of the normal formation with 3-car trains of Kinky Chariot cars passing near Sporting Club. This is a line which is phenomenally busy all day. Next, please. Very, very good traffic. Here's a set coming into the 3-track terminus at Place Sagou in Alexandria. Next, please. And what has happened to provide extra capacity on the inner sections of the line, or between San Stefano and Ras-el-Tin, is that new routes have been introduced, worked by these coupled Kinky Chariot sets of 1982. And these are very unusual in that they have been retrofitted with pantographs whilst retaining the trolley pole. So the 2-car set has 4 means of current collection between the 2 cars. Next, please. The reason for that is that the Ramleh line is still worked with pantographs throughout. And here's a side view of one of these sets, which you can possibly see a bit better, the pantographs and the trolley poles. Next, please. Why the trolley poles? Well, when the car gets to Place Sagou, which is the terminus of the Ramleh line, it goes on to City Metals. Next, please. And at that point, it's on the City tramway, which is worked by trolley pole equipped cars. And so the pantograph is taken down, and a pointsman or a point man there puts up the trolley pole for the leading car to take current on its onward journey to Ras-el-Tin. This is the interchange point. Next, please. The cars which are so equipped, dual equipped, have now gained this red and yellow livery. The one you saw in the previous photograph, I think, was waiting to be done. Obviously, it takes a little while to get right through the fleet. Next, please. This is Ras-el-Tin terminus with a Duvet car on the loop, one of 2 loops available from both directions. Next, please. And in the city, emerging from one of the narrow streets in the central area. When I was there, as I say, 15 months ago, the track was still down but out of use. Whether it will come back or not, I don't know. Next, please. Views of the Med here, Mediterranean Sea in the background at Ras-el-Tin, with this Kinky Chariot 2-car set about to take the curves into the terminal loop. Next, please. And along the waterfront at Ras-el-Tin, with the bay, various fish restaurants, yachting marina and so forth, all lining the quay. Next, please. Now we're at the other end of the system at Carmouse, which traditionally was very much the down market end of the system, and really still is, although the filling in of the canal alongside the tramway has made a big difference to the atmosphere here. Next, please. This is at one of the junctions in the city, three-way junction, just down from the railway station. Next, please. And in the city centre, just 100 yards or so from Place Sagou, where the Ramley cars terminate, this is one of the Kinky Chariot sets heading off towards Ras El Tin on its jaunt around the bay. Next, please. The area around Alexandria Station is extremely congested with market stalls, most of which spill out onto the tram track and have to be moved back every time a tram comes. Next, please. And here's a more recent view of one of the Gantz sets. Next, please. And another one at the terminal point near Orabi Square. Next, please. In the days when trams came both from the side street and from the round to the right to the Copenhagen Divags, and you'll be pleased to see that they've managed to find some glass to fit the full depth of the windows, even if in two parts, with an opening slider in the top portion, makes them look much more gainly and resembling how they were built. Next, please. Some of you will be aware that two of the Copenhagen Duvags have been repatriated and gone to the Skodnes Home Museum in Denmark. This is Carmouse with the depot in the background. That's the original depot of 1899, which has been partly adapted now as a works. Next, please. And there we are, the look inside the works at Carmouse. They do a lot of their own overhauls in very difficult conditions. I think it's quite a tribute both to the workforce, the undertaking, and the trams that they've kept going for so long. Next, please. And we don't see many rear views, so I put that in if only to give a contrast with an older but still quite prevalent form of transport. Next, please. And of course, the passengers spill out onto the track. This is the reserve track at El Wardian. Next, please. But even more so on the line to Carmouse, and is a good example here of the street market, which takes up almost every available square centimetre of space and has to be moved backwards and forwards as the trams progress towards Carmouse. Next, please. And a similar situation at the railway station. Next, please. These views were taken more recently in October 2022, by which time the majority of the trams have been repainted in this green and ivory livery. Another view at Carmouse. Always a good location to take shunting shots. Next, please. One of them here, one of a small number, being repainted in this blue and yellow livery. Others have been repainted in red and cream, but none of them came out whilst I was there, and some of them have had a fairly heavy rebuild. Next, please. Another view into Carmousse depot, into the works. I don't know how many of the Duvags are still in service. I do know that in 2004, which is the last time I had an official visit, they told us that 89 of the 99 were still running. I get the impression that a few more have been withdrawn, but not many. So probably between 75 and 80 are still in operation. Next, please. This is on the street running section to Noosa, with on the left a repainted and rebuilt Duvag, and one still in the yellow livery that looks as though it's in need of some attention going into Noosa. Next, please. Green cars on the emergency reverser at Muharrem Bay. You might imagine, but with all this street running, there are long delays on the tramway from time to time because of obstructions. And whilst we were waiting there, 5 cars came through in convoy, of which the first 2 were regulated there and reversed onto this stub reverser. Next, please. Repainted Gantz set in the green and cream. The Gantz sets were not very conspicuous during my 2022 visit. Next, please. But there were 2 or 3 of them out, and here's one in the blue and yellow on the turning loop at the railway station. Next, please. And inside one of the Alexandria and Ramley cars, we've got what passes for a route plan, which isn't much use to European language speakers. Next, please. Well, the most recent rolling stock deliveries have been of these Ukrainian-built Type K1 articulated cars, and they are to be found running on the through services between the Ramley line and Ras El Tin. You can see here one in common with a Ramley set near Sporting Club. Next, please. And 2 Ramley sets. Not difficult for them to get very close together, I can tell you. The frequency is a very high one. Next, please. And at the first of the junctions, this particular set lined out with this V front and a yellow stripe along the side panels of the middle car. I don't know why, we couldn't find out. It must be something special, but it looks very smart. Next, please. 2 of the Ukrainian cars approaching Bulkley. Next, please. And further out towards El Nasser. Next, please. Rather wonderful, not something you expect to find in a place like Egypt, but they have recovered this bogie single-deck car, one of those built in the mid-20s, done it up in this red and cream livery, and it could even be 501 that we saw a few minutes ago as a works car. I don't know, I'll try and find out more. It apparently runs every day, at least every day when it's serviceable, but it doesn't have a regular schedule. So you just have to lie and wait until it turns up. But rather nice and running in normal service. Next, please. Here's a 3-car train approaching, or rather on what passes for street track at a very elongated road crossing near Bulkley. Next, please. And here again, 2 of the Ukrainian cars. There's the track here reserved track on reservation, much more typical of the great majority of the line. Next, please. And this is the turning circle at San Stefano. The turning circle was put in some years ago to make life easier for turning single-ended cars. Because at one time, when I first saw it in 1975, there was no turning circle. This is the limit of operation of these cars because they are single-ended, and El Nasser is a stub terminus. Next, please. And here we are with one of the double-deck cars. And actually, I think I'm right in saying that this one is marshalled at the El Nasser end of the set. Next, please. And here we are, we see examples of both rolling stock, the Alexandrian Ramley Japanese cars on the left and the Ukrainian-built K1 on the right, having come in from Ras El Tin. Next, please. And to facilitate the running with these cars, a new turning circle has been created a couple of 100 meters short of the central terminus of the Ramley line in Alexandria for short journeys that do not go through to Ras El Tin, and there are quite a few of those. So here we are. This is one emerging from this fairly tight radius turning circle. Next, please. And I think finally for Ras El Tin, for Alexandria, I show you this view of one of the new Ukrainian-built cars travelling on trolley pole, of course, on the Ras El Tin section with the pantograph retracted. Next, please. Just outside Alexandria is a very sad sight. There's a plot of land adjacent to the main road on which are dumped a huge number of Berlin trams, Tatra trams from Berlin, KT4s, KT6s. I think the importer was hopeful that he'd be able to persuade Alexandria to take them. And I hear rumours every so often that they're going to try some, but they certainly hadn't done so by October 2022. Who knows? Things do change in Egypt. And I'm going to finish not with a sad sight like this, but something mildly more encouraging. Next, please. Because we're going in a moment, when we've passed on from these Berlin cars, we're going to Egypt's newest tramway. Next, please. And this is at Madinati, which is a shopping mall. It's probably about 30 or 40 kilometers outside Cairo. And in order to save people's footsteps, they've actually installed a circular tram route, single track with 4 trams, all battery operated and with open top double deck bodies built by Severn Lamb in England, with workshops at Ulster and headquarters at Stratford upon Avon. The building in the background with the slightly open doors is the tram depot, and all 4 cars live in there. The service normally starts at 4 p.m. and goes through till about 10 p.m. when the shopping mall closes, and the number of cars operated depends on the demand on any one day. So here are 2 of them, the red and the blue car. Next, please. On the day we were there, only the red car was running. So the green and the yellow cars were kept in the depot, but we were able to photograph them. Next, please. The line is just over a kilometre round. It's not dead straight, as you can see. There are some curves. and passing one of the booths where you can obtain refreshment. And travel on the tram is free of charge. Next, please. And as I say, they run into the hours of darkness, and rather optimistically passing a place called Bosporus, the red car moves back towards its terminus and the depot. Next, please. And I hope that you've enjoyed tonight's show. And if you've never been to Egypt, I haven't put you off to Mac to go back. Thank you.